Good afternoon. I'm Celestino Perez, so I go by Tino. I'm the Chair of Executive Strategic Leadership here at the U.S. Army War College, and I welcome you to panel number 5 on the military profession and leadership. I think it's important that we spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a military leader, and especially what it means to be a military professional. There's been significant challenges in the recent past with respect to the profession of arms that people have called attention to, that we need to take, that we need to reshape the way we think about the profession. So I think thinking about ordnance delivery, that is logistics and operating in a data-centric environment, in a contested environment, these get to priorities of Secretary Army Wormuth with respect to charting a strategic path amidst uncertainty and operating in contested environments. And these are 2 priorities, 2 objectives that she has that we're very comfortable with. But I want to call attention to 2 other priorities right now, and then a third in a moment, that I think more thinking about the profession can help us with. So her Secretary Wormuth's 4th priority is building a positive command climate across scales in all Army formations. And the thing I call attention to here, the emblem, is the investigation into Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood, all the lead up and then the aftermath and the events surrounding that. It's the role of leaders who need to chart the path forward with the profession, and it's leaders who are going to need to look into how we prevent these sorts of tragedies from happening in the force. Another priority that Secretary Wormuth has is ensuring that we adapt and recruit and retain the best talent. There's no doubt that in the United States today we operate in a politicized environment. Yet we need to draw persons who are willing to serve the United States of America in uniform, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of partisanship. And what this means is that the military has to be seen by the citizenry with trust, that it is not going to be used as a political football by either the American left politically or the American right politically, but it's going to go forward. So along with this is then the 5th priority of Secretary Wormuth is reducing harmful behaviors. So the Secretary thinks that these 3 priorities are important for us, and I want to bring them to the forefront as we begin a conversation about the profession of arms. One of the hallmarks of the profession is that we develop new knowledge. And in the United States, we develop new knowledge about professions that other militaries around the world copy. That's because we lead. And so we have 4 presentations, 5 panelists today who are going to talk about their inquiry, their research into the Army profession, in I think very interesting and compelling ways. So the first presentation will be by Richard Lockument, a former dean at the U.S. Army War College in the School of Strategic Land Power. He's the director of the National Security Policy Program and a current researcher at the Strategic Studies Institute and a mentor of mine. So he's going to start off with a paper co-written with Tom or Neo Galvin, whom I teach with on a regular basis. And they're going to talk about furthering a project that Don Snyder started many decades ago with respect to the Army profession. The second paper will be given by Neo Galvin himself, and he'll present that, on providing strategic agility for the next big war. And then Rick O'Donnell, who's an analyst at the Center for Strategic Leadership, is going to talk about his work on strategic leader assessments for the Army as a whole, but then how he's going to bring that research here for the benefit of the U.S. Army War College. And then finally, my student, twice over from Leavenworth, and here I invited Anastasia McKay. She's an Army physician who's been writing about the profession and presenting about the profession for many years now, and I think she's going to give you a provocative argument from her vantage point as an Army doctor with respect to what's going to happen with respect to injuries in great power war, which we hope never happens. So all leaders should be interested in what she has to say.
So we'll set up the thesis for how to better understand the military, both for civilians and for military professionals. All right, next slide. And really at that core of this, what should the U.S. military profession's role be on behalf of American society for the future? And this, what that monograph that I described frames, and it's called Framing the Future of the Military Profession, because it really kind of lays out the main analytical framework and the big questions. And it draws on that previous work by Don Snyder and the group who worked with him, and I was one of the participants in the second edition of the Future of the Army Profession. But it's really this, so we're in the early stages of this larger project. So when I assert some of the things here, so a lot of these are preliminary thoughts about how to reconcile some of these issues. Next slide. Contemporary challenges, tying into what Tino pointed out and that came from Secretary Wormuth, among others, a lot of the same things we've heard, that changing character of war, particularly sort of at the high end technologically, cyber and space domains in particular stand out. What I was kind of hinting at when it talks about differences between what civilian and military leaders mean by military activities, oftentimes is our, some version of, a default to combat for the military is probably the simplest one. People understand the sort of the war fighting part, but the war winning part tends to involve a lot of things beyond just the combat capabilities that tend to get short shrift, both by the military, people in the military and by civilian leaders. So how to understand that better, not over-militarize foreign policy, where I think we've been asked to do things, but we really, as servants of society, need to be sensitive. There's a lot of things the military does outside of sort of clear combat or clearly defined sort of use of violence or coercive force that society does need and we need to provide. And we've seen the lack of strategic effectiveness. So when you think of the crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, all these areas where what the United States has, when the United States has leaned into use of the military, the overall outcomes haven't been what we would hope. And that's both, I would say, blame to go around to civilian and military leaders in terms of how we operate there. And then Tino mentioned some of the norms, societal norms. Have we actually understood how the character of war affects things like what role different, particularly I think gender roles are probably the biggest one we've been confronting lately in terms of what that means for the future of the military and who can do what sorts of roles. And the issue of the partisanship or the politicization of the armed forces. And really, and Tom will talk more about this, glowing test of professionalism in general, looking at what's happened to the medical professionals, legal professionals, when you talk about society writ large and the belief in what a profession does, professional does. Next slide. And so I've identified the standard, or really the tensions, and those are some of the works that we're building on. Next slide. We're leaning heavily on Abbott's model. I think this is where Huntington and Janowitz don't help us in terms of putting that military profession in kind of a box for U.S. civil military relations, whereas this is more about how professions interact more broadly. And this is really where kind of how all professions, medical, legal, military professions, argue with society, with our leaders, elected and appointed, to figure out what roles we should have. And I'd be happy to talk more about that question and answer, but next slide. And skip this one for now. Next slide. This is really sort of the core of, when we say, here are the jurisdictions of practice, external in terms of combat, stabilization, other things, and then an internal part. We have agency, we, military, the members of the military, have the dominant agency for how to develop expert knowledge, and really very heavily in PME, as you might imagine, but really throughout our entire developmental structure. The other jurisdictions that we have to be experts in. And then just two slides real quick that are eye charts that I don't, next slide please, that I don't expect you to, this is said, there is detail behind this is in the monograph, but this is how we get to articulating, and this was a map of the Army profession that we had, that we're looking to sort of expand to other parts of the profession. So I don't expect you to be able to read all this. It's a chart in the monograph, but talks about what are sort of our core expertise, what we share, what we borrow, and then next slide. When we think about those jurisdictions, where we divide them up, where we tend to have full responsibility for like combat operations and shared when you think of stabilization with State Department and USAID and others, and ones where we are purely subordinate, firefighting, where we're not going to develop expert knowledge, but we've got disciplined manpower to support those sorts of things. And I'll go ahead and stop there and turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit more about the sociological side.
Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, my role in this was to kind of extend the framework, because there's a lot of things that we drew from Abbott and other sources in the first and the second iterations of the Profession Project. But when it came to looking at some of the contemporary challenges, there's some things that Abbott were not, parts of Abbott that were not used. And we find that the contemporary challenges sort of say we need to expand our thoughts about what it is that we're looking at. So I went back to Abbott and I drew in some parts, some additional parts from his framework to think about how do they apply. One of them was Abbott's conception of professional work which is basically what it is that professionals do. And this is where we get into the fact that we divide the professional work in the Army a certain way, a whole bunch of different ways. We have all sorts of communities that are doing pockets of the various bits of work that were shown in the previous charts. And so looking at this, what we found was that, especially in the bubble down at the bottom on abstract knowledge, Abbott's framework looks at abstract knowledge as the entire compendium of everything that the profession has learned, not just what is currently vetted and released to the public or basically in use, but the whole history of how that knowledge was formed. And this is something that we hadn't really looked at. So we think that this part of the model will help us think about how do we establish, modify, update, split, divide, combine jurisdictions in order to accomplish our mission. Skip ahead 6, please. That one. Another thing that was a bit of a gap is that, in the first edition of the profession book, the Abbott had a chapter that talked about the Army as a profession and an organization simultaneously. And getting back to this piece on division of labor, we started to think about, well, in some instances, professions are competitive, but in our case, there's also a lot of collaboration. Abbott was solely about the competition of professions, but of course, when we think about the ground, the aerospace, and the maritime profession, and all of the other professions that come on, there are instances in which they collaborate as well. And so what we wanted to do is think about, all right, how do we model collaborations? We needed to bring something else in order to do that. Next slide. And this is where we're taking not just Abbott's model, but also adding communities of practice. And the communities of practice, the literature on that looks a lot like Abbott. There is a jurisdiction, which he called a domain, shared mission, shared purpose, shared concern, but it's not necessarily tied to a particular specific area of expert knowledge. It may be an area of interest that is shared by a bunch of people who don't come from the same backgrounds. And that collaborative sense we felt was pretty important when we think about how we behave as a profession. Go on to the next slide. Let me see. Sorry, skip ahead 3. Right, no, go back 1, sorry. So what we're looking at here is the original projects, we're looking at the Army bubble, just the Army bubble. And what we're looking at was, what is the Army as a profession? Well, when we add in communities of practice, now we're starting to think about, well, what is the defense, the areas of knowledge or pockets of expert knowledge that belong at the defense level? The previous project included chapters about should there be a joint profession. Now we're really seriously thinking about what would that profession look like. The answer was kind of sort of yes in that chapter. We think the answer is more definitively yes, but maybe it has more of a community of practice feel. And then you have all of this intra-service communities of practice that may include things like what we consider to be branches, like medical, like legal, but also human resources, the G1 community of practice, resource management, so you have folks from the same area of expertise who work together collaboratively across organizations. And then you have, like, when I was part of the stand-up U.S. Africa Command, and there was a community of practice of Africanists who came from all over. They weren't even within the Department of Defense, but they were from other agencies. So we're trying to think about modeling that. Within the Department of Command Leadership and Management that I belong to, we're taking a very serious look at the professionalism of the defense management function and the areas of expertise in that. A lot of the talk, a lot of the panels that we've had in this conference have had a defense management flavor in terms of we take requirements and we turn them into resources, et cetera. And so what we've been doing is we have been looking at improving the way that we teach defense managers. And one of this particular paper on enterprise readiness is one of the byproducts of that long-term effort. I want to acknowledge Con Crane, who I see in the back, and Mike Lynch, who helped with the initial phases of this. The way that this particular project started was a question that Con Crane once asked me was intellectual readiness. How do we know that we're ready at the defense enterprise to be able to prosecute the next big war? Next slide. So we tried to get our arms around what does that actually mean, because we focus our readiness thought on the operational units and are they ready to fight, but what about the enterprise in terms of being able to transition from the war that we are expecting and therefore build our force structure, our modernization, our readiness around, and to then transition to what's the actual war that we're facing. This is about strategic agility, which helps offset strategic surprise. Okay? Next slide. I'll skip this one. I'll say that there was a vignette that I used as sort of to justify the, pursuing the question. This was it, Fifth Court of CJTF 7. I won't go into it too much. Go ahead, 2. So what we ultimately came up with was, and I talked about the 2 submeasures, we ultimately came up with that to understand the readiness of the enterprise for strategic agility essentially means we have to think about how do we measure the enterprise's ability to set the force for the expected war and then also transition to the actual war. There are 5 outputs which we basically had come up with, and our paper is still kind of in the proposal phase, and some of these may warrant expansion, and I'm happy to engage in a conversation about it. I'll show them here, but I'll go to the next slide, which details them a little bit more. And I want you to kind of focus on the yellow bullets here. So, we know that a measure of enterprise readiness is its ability to analyze the environment. What does that mean? It's both understanding the environment, explaining the environment, forecasting the environment, and then recognizing when we are transitioning from something we expect to something that is actually happening. Now, concepts and doctrine, this is where the point I made about abstract knowledge comes into play, because it isn't just the published official numbered documents that we're talking about. It is everything that came before, all of the earlier versions of said documents, the thought process, the history of how did we come to think that this is the vision of the future war that we're fighting, that we're going to fight and going to plan around, and also how we do things. But also think about equivalent ideas among all of those different communities of practice. What does the medical community of practice see as its way of supporting the war? The legal, the aviation, by branch, by group, whatever you come up with. So it's much more than just the published end result, if you will. Next slide. And then these are the other 3. Organization design is something that as I'm pushing to try to incorporate a bit more into the defense management curriculum. How do we decide to design what goes into designing the force? What goes into deciding, for example, what we're going to structure? It's dividing the labor, stationing the force, deciding how we're going to man the force. The space is more than the faces, but it's all of these questions that basically that the enterprise sets to say that this is the structure that we're going to build, this is where we're going to put everything, and so on. Requirements articulation is kind of like the lead into the whole business of modernization. How do we measure the success or the failure or whatever of our modernization efforts? And it kind of begins with, how do we identify gaps? What do we constitute consider as a gap? What's the appropriate level for us to pursue plugging a gap? Enterprise level, say at a service, or the joint level, or just within a community of practice, or even lower if it's something that can be handled at unit level. And then outreach is what capabilities out there to help us be networked adequately so we can reach out and get at the intellectual capital that we need outside of the organization if it's something that we can't handle organically. How do we know that our networks are strong or are adequate for us to be able to reach out and learn what we need to learn? Next slide. So this is my last slide. What we're trying to do is, come to grips with this, because a lot of this are things that are very, very difficult to measure, not certainly in a quantitative sense. It's going to be more, perhaps, qualitative. But what we're trying to do is to present this to students as a way to think about, for example, separating what it is that they need to be doing professionally at the enterprise level versus those things that are perhaps, separating the bureaucracy, moving from, say, learning how to turn the crank of the machine and thinking about being the machine's engineers and architects.
Good afternoon. So while the previous presenters had talked about what we need to be thinking about in terms of what it is we're going to be doing, and then how do we assess our readiness in getting it, I'm going to focus on the who part of this. Who are these individuals? What are their unique attributes that allow us to be prepared for the future? So we've been working here at the War College for about 5 years specifically on these projects, and it starts off with an identification of what are these key attributes that we think more is better, or it helps determine the difference between good and great. So if I threw an example up that we need people who can think, right? Everyone says, of course we do. We need people who can communicate. Well, sure, right? Well, then, if we know that's important, can we set up a program where we start assessing that within the individual? So we started this work before the stand-up of the Army Talent Management Task Force, and we started really looking at these attributes to try to first understand, are these the right attributes? And secondly, can we actually assess them? So this is a body of work where there's several cognitive scientists, psychologists. This is really deep inside your head trying to figure out how those wheels are spinning. And what we're finding is we're starting to be able to tell. All right? Now that's not only here, but I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the talent management, which I'm part of, and I'm a project manager for one of the exercises that's conducted out there, right? So this intent then has permeated the entire force. We're looking for a culture of assessment. We want it to start as far left as possible in the career continuum. We want that early stage, or those early stages, to be more developmental, where we're going to inform you where you're at. And this is not where we're trying to bring everyone up to one bar, but we're trying to make everybody the best that they can be, realizing that there's going to be distinct differences between people. And the art in this then is, if we can tell that, can we then put those folks in the right positions of leadership, of building our Army, et cetera, right? So the start was kind of pure in that the chief had come to us and said, look, two comments. One, I'm having a tough time distinguishing who to pick from the 1 and 2 stars I have. And two, my senior leaders can't think strategically. All right, get on it. That's where we started. So after multiple exercises, conferences, we started narrowing down the list of things that we said, okay, we all kind of agree these are important. What kind of assessments do we have out there to do them? So I will tell you, like when you look at strategic thinking, we look at that as a combination of things like critical thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking, thinking in time. It's not a noun, but it's a verb, right? So then if we can measure those component parts, then theoretically we have an idea of who's better at it than somebody else. And if the job requires that, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go down the list of things that the body of work says are important, and I'll kind of give you a check on what it is that we're looking at. So the capacity to think strategically, an effective communicator. I shouldn't see a whole lot of negative heads because these are all common sense things. This is where it gets a little tricky. Above average fluid intelligence. Now, if you're not familiar with fluid intelligence, I'll give it to you in layman's term. It's your ability to figure out crap, all right? This is our world as we know it. You're getting into a situation, you got to figure it out. Fluid intelligence is a real good measure of that. Your negotiation skills. I think as you go up, you can honestly see how that's important. This one's going to be a little tricky, and we're actually going to get after it this year out at CCAP, and this is this idea of moral ethical reasoning, right? There's not one piece of doctrine that doesn't say we need it, but we have no assessment to say, do you have it? How much of it do you have? Or are you kind of a flaming guy that we need to be watching out for, right? So we're going to start getting after that at the higher level. Multicultural effectiveness. Obviously, I think with what we've been involved in over the last 15 years, we know that is absolutely essential. Cross-domain military and whole of government expertise. This is this whole outside of M and across dime, right? Again, I shouldn't see a whole lot of negative heads because we all say, yeah, well, sure, you need to know that. Your self-awareness or your metacognition, we all believe that that's the difference between good and great leaders, those that are self-aware. Intellectual curiosity, which I think here at the schoolhouse is something we need, but across the force, it's absolutely something that has to be in the senior leaders. They ought to be questioning everything and learning as they're moving. This, number 10, I want to spend a little bit of time on because this really gets into the multi-domain operations. So we start, about 3 years ago, we start getting after this, what we call a TQ, or a technological competence. And this really is starting to get after big data, AI-informed decision-making, and AIDS, all right? So if we know that's going to be important, what are those attributes that a person has or does not have that's going to allow them to flourish or flame out in that environment, right? And we believe there's going to be these markers that we have to figure out. Certainly physical and mental wellness, and then establishes positive supportive relationships, right? There's nothing in there that's not in every piece of doctrine that says, yeah, we need to be able to do all these things. So we think if we can focus on this initial list, that we're going to start really setting the framework for the Army to learn about what it's looking for in leaders. What I always argue is this list is not wrong, but I am sure it's incomplete. I am sure there are other things that we're going to have to go out as we go in the future. So then I'll just wrap up by saying, what are we doing about it? Well, if you're paying attention, or if you're part of this, you know that we're starting to assess folks in BOLIC, and this falls under Project Athena. We're starting to assess folks in the Captain's Career Course, and there's actually 2 assessments. There's a Project Athena assessment, and then there's an Army Talent Management Task Force. They're getting hit twice at the Captain's Career Course. Same with CGSC. They're getting hit by Athena, and Athena is the developmental model, and then you have the task force stuff kind of over top, which is really getting at talent management type initiatives. That brings us to the BCAP, the Battalion Commander's Assessment Program, and CCAP, the Colonel's Command Assessment Program. So for folks tracking, a lot of these attributes are being looked at, right? They're being looked at every level. We're not totally synchronized across that career continuum, but we have a method for starting to get there, right? The folks that are working it understand that one has to feed the other, and that some of these attributes we're talking about, strategic thinking as an example, takes a decade or more to really grow in a person. It's not something you could say, take strategic thinking 101, 201, 301, here's your diploma. It doesn't quite work that way. And many of these attributes are that building approach. BCAP right now is really set up for fitness for command, right? And certainly the things you can kind of make sense of. It's toxic leaders is the big phrase that we're trying to weed out right now. The Colonel's Command Assessment Program, the BCAPers will start showing up to CCAP within 2 years. Right now, the programs are very similar. Within 2 years, they want the CCAP to really focus on strategic potential. All right, so if you see all these attributes, you see where we're trying to go. So we kind of know what we need to do. We think about how we're going to do it, and this really kind of wraps it up by saying, how do we determine who the right folks are to do what we're asking them to do?
Today I was going to start off and discuss one of my research projects at the War College, which answered the question, does the Army need surgeons on active duty? Now, it might seem like an odd question, especially when we're thinking about the context of large-scale combat operations, where the number of casualties we're going to face are somewhat unthinkable. And of course, we need surgeons. We need surgeons to help take care of the casualties that we're going to expect in war. Now, I've previously studied dual loyalties that medical corps officers face, and I've argued that military medicine deserves its own jurisdictional space as a unique profession. Sometimes when you look at the dual professions, you can trump one profession against another. Am I a doctor first or am I an officer first? And depending on who you speak to, military commanders will, put primacy on being an officer first, where within the medical field, people will identify with being a physician first. But in looking at the unique jurisdictional space of military medicine, there's actually a separate area of complexity where military physicians can flourish. But you might come up with some counterintuitive inclusions about which specialties actually belong within the profession. And one of those specialties is that of surgeons. So for context, the military has 42 different types of docs within the military. Surgeons are specifically those doctors that repair organs or remove organs or perform operations. Sometimes we lose that because of the military historically looking at surgeons in terms of an advisory role where you have division surgeons, command surgeons, and corps surgeons. These are doctors. They're not necessarily surgeons that operate and perform surgery. So now I come from the active component, and I have some significant gaps in my understanding of the reserve components because I come with that lens of everything being on active duty. And when I look at professions, I think of professions in terms of being a full-time job. If you're a profession, it's kind of what I do all the time. So I specifically tailored this research question to look at, do we need surgeons on active duty? And try to understand a little bit more of our force structure and the components we have. The Army's medical and operational communities assume that surgeons must be on active duty. Since the Army must be prepared to deploy quickly to any area in the world, so too must its surgeons. So in my research, I combined historical and theoretical analysis to evaluate first, the military's need for surgeons, second, how the military trains and prepares surgeons for deployment, and then finally, a comparison of that surgical capability across components. And I found that active duty surgeons have great difficulty maintaining their skills. It takes 14 to 16 years after high school to produce a surgeon. And if surgeons are not operating and practicing their skills, they have challenges with professional acceptance as actually being surgeons and having the credentials to perform surgery. Moreover, the military has too few surgeons to satisfy its wartime needs. This isn't just active duty, this is active duty and reserve component. The military does not have enough surgeons. In the event of large-scale combat operations, we're going to require expansion, and we're going to need to mobilize surgeons point blank. The final problem that we have is these frequent non-combat deployments. A lot of the deploying for competition to provide security and to be available. These frequent deployments, along with low financial compensation, military surgeons often earning about 20% of what their counterparts are earning on the civilian sector, and the chronic limitations in their ability to apply their surgical expertise threatens the retention of surgeons. And my conclusion is that the Army does not need surgeons on active duty. Instead, we could transition surgeons to a reserve component, which can better align to operational needs, as well as the surgeon's professional requirements. However, any changes in force structure would have cascading implications, especially involving recruitment, training, and utilization of surgeons outside of war. One of the primary arguments against removing surgeons from active duty include that the military requires a rapidly accessible surgical force, and it takes at least 30 days to mobilize surgeons from the reserves, which is too long. Additionally, that the reserve force is chronically undermanned, and so we have active component surgeons filling in for reserve missions currently. And there's no guarantee that moving surgeons into the reserves would actually help and improve retention or our ability to respond long-term. I believe that the assumption surgeons must be available for immediate worldwide deployment is at times overstated. And we often have advanced warning that precedes major conflict, enabling some time to mobilize and respond. If we're strategically looking at our environment, picture Ukraine and Russia and the time it took prior to the invasion, we do have time where we can respond and mobilize. Additionally, there may be ways to mitigate risk in terms of ADOS orders, where you can have rotating surgeons on for a shorter period of time that can help provide a more rapid ability to respond should we have a crisis. There are several other implications that I'm happy to discuss in terms of question and answer and how it relates further on. But even though we have a medical requirement, perhaps planning for having surgeons on active duty, we may inadvertently be contributing to the loss of surgeons and loss of a capability for when we need it most, which would be during a war or large-scale conflict.